Try again. Hey, John. We hearing each other okay?
You're still a little quiet, but I can hear you.
That's not good. I just caught news that Ruth Bader Ginsburg just passed away.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Super sad. Wow. Yeah, that's big news.
If true, that's big news. Yeah. Wow. Well, we could find out in 10 seconds. It will be splattered over Twitter, the fastest news source around. She's died. Oh, that's true. Yeah. Sure, she had metastatic pancreatic cancer. Holy smoke.
Mm.
Yeah. So, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
An amazing American, no matter, almost everybody would say it's a pretty big deal. They might disagree about why and whether what's likely to happen and whether it's likely to be good.
Yeah.
In any way, or what's likely to be good about it. But if nothing else, it's a very sad thing. She was an amazing human being.
Yeah. Yeah, I know she did some pretty big things in her time. I meant to watch a movie. There was a movie about her life, basically, that I never watched. But
there's a couple of them, and they're very good. Well, one is a documentary about her life, which is exceptional, and the other one is a drama about her life, and I don't remember the name of either of them, but I've watched them both, and they're great. Lisa and I went to see her when she came to the University of Notre Dame. I'm going to guess that was 4 years ago, maybe. My sense of time is not super. But she actually left a big, we quote her all the time in our home. She had a line that Lisa and I both heard together, and it had to do with married life, families, and getting stuff done that you want to get done in the press of a busy life. And her line was, you can have it all, just not all at once. Meaning you really have to pace. So she and her husband, for example, spent different times. They both had pretty substantial legal careers. Hers, of course, advanced a little more famously in the end, but they both had very substantial legal careers. At one point, he was out in front of her. At different times, different ones of them were home, while the other one, accomplished some heavy lift. So we maybe on Monday ought to talk about the implications of this. They will be very significant, and they will start to shape up. Or maybe it should be Wednesday. It'd be a natural thing to talk about it on Wednesday, but maybe both. We'll see. We'll bring some, pay some attention to it.
Yeah.
Let's see. If you're okay with it, John, I would like to plunge ahead and finish something that I started a week ago and get this sort of behind us, get it finished and make some progress. And what it is that I wanted to get finished is to re-articulate the each of the lenses in the three lens matrix, for which there are problem, resource, solution triplets to go through, right? And when we go through them, the idea is to be able to credibly identify resources and understand the roles they play, those resources play in the reconceptualization or relensing of some domain of life, right? And can these be done in smaller sets that are useful, but can they be combined, and do they need to be combined into more powerful sets that do more together than any of them do individually? And moving through that representative set of problems, not just a random sampling, an awful lot of problems, and rethinking directions for solutions in all of those areas. Can we plausibly argue that we really can identify resources that can be clustered in lenses that have sort of beginning, middle, and an end, have got some individual integrity as lenses, but which also operate together? If that were the case, you could take these on one at a time. That might be useful. You could bring a lot of people in to share one of these lenses without sharing everything, right? Because there's this other lens, we could talk about that later.
Yeah.
But still get some bang rather than simply have, you could get some parallel processing going amongst people who, for their various reasons, adopt a certain lens, even abstracting from disagreements they might have, or even just questions they might have. I don't know what I think about these other things you think, but this group makes sense to me, right? And it's a powerful group, and it sheds light on a lot of problems, so I want to buy in to that. That would be a nice tool to have, right? You could go shopping for partners with a tool like that. If you could just figure out how to extend effective invitations to come and see through a lens like that, if only imaginatively, right? That invitation, if you could make it effectively and if you could make it at scale, would go some way toward self-assembly, right? If not all at once, maybe assembly on the first floor, right? Just to use a building analogy, I don't know whether floor is the right. These are not necessarily stories where you're adding one to another, but until that analogy breaks down, we might as well try it. Okay. So let me share a screen here for a moment and skip over Twitter, as interesting and important as it is. Yeah, this would be a good time to watch one of those movies, John, or both of them. They're both exceptional movies, and you could get them, and they would really enliven your observations as we move through, as we're going to. Pretty wild, right, in American political life, as if 2020 weren't wild already. It's about to get really wild, right? Okay. So let me then revisit this three-lens spiral matrix. And today I want to talk about this perspectival conscious realism, just to grab a group of propositions by a phrase. And secondly, if we get that far, we might not, something called loving integration, because I don't have a really good name for it yet. It's further out in the development stage. I want to talk about each of those in turns as a lens, and then I want to talk about combining lenses. And here, we've already seen this, at least we have, if you've been able to work through what happened last Friday, where I basically, I worked through this whole very rich set of bullet points here, or the bullet points may not be that rich, but the ideas that they try to grab as handles and pull into the conversation are somewhat richer. And that you can put a bullet point on it instills confidence that you might be able to make it propositional or some small subset of propositions, because these are not big points, each of them. I don't mean they're not big or profound or important. That's wrong. They might be all of those things, but they're not everything, and they're plainly not everything because they're different than all their neighbors just sitting inside this list. So we've worked through all of that. And today I want to work through a much shorter list. And because it's so much shorter, I want to spend a little bit of time with how it is a lens also. We've spent, frankly, an enormous amount of time in this high information flow network of rich communities already. And we've sort of talked about it as a lens in the past and assembled it in the past. And so there was nothing that came up in this conversation that was brand new in that sketch done of this whole last Friday. Nothing was new. Here, we've talked about some of these individual propositions, and we've even talked about what it is to take consciousness as fundamental. But this is but there's more to it, and I'd say we've never really quite got this lens off the ground, number one, as a lens. So let's do that tonight. That's the scale. That's the hope. And then maybe yet one other lens, and it's shorter still because it just is short. So because this first one's shorter, let's construct it and let's see what we can see with it. And let's do all that at a 30,000 foot, very high level. But with a particular focus on the lensedness of this thing, or that this thing is a lens. And let's start with the idea. Let's start with an experience of consciousness. I'm going to call it integrative consciousness. And here I'm starting where a bunch of consciousness theorists starts. And I'm not talking about Donald Hoffman, who is a conscious realist. And there are others who are too, not very many. I'm talking about folks, for example, like Tonino and his partner, his name's escaping me, but it'll pop back in any minute, who are integrated information theorists of consciousness. These are folks who think that they are physicalists, to use the language which at least some other people would use, they might too, of the commitments that they have. In other words, they think there's a material world that's fundamental. They probably accept the standard model of particle physics, for example, is a pretty good account of an account that needs to be integrated with relativity, and they take that the word of all the physicists on that front, and they know there's work to be done, but they think that somehow there is a physical world, and thus there's a hard problem of consciousness, and they accept all that, and they're working on that hard problem, and they do it by laying out some features of consciousness and saying, here's what consciousness seems to be. It's got, I think there's a half a dozen that Tonino will explain. And we can identify the causes of that state of affairs. We can identify the causes, and that the presence, the smallest set of those causes is consciousness, he'll say. So he's giving an account of what consciousness is. That's a very different account. And all I'm doing here is grabbing the phenomenon, is pointing out that the phenomenology that they use, in other words, just what they think they see when they look at consciousness. And they're looking after many years of what's the phrase they use? It's psychophysics, maybe is the word they use for the study, something like the mathematical study of conscious phenomena. And this has been going on for a really long time. So among the features, so that's sort of this where these people are coming from, like Tonino, et cetera. And they point out that consciousness is integrative in some way. What that means is in one single field of view are a bunch of parts. And those bunch of parts, and here I'm looking at a wall in front of me, and a plug, and a computer, and a rug has expanse, right? And there's sound, and the sound is multi-directional. And there's sight, and the sight is multicolored, and there's a ton of information that's pouring in, but we integrate it into one experience that is not the same as other experiences. It is what it is. It's not something else. And here I may be conflating from lack of preparation. I should go back over Tonino's categories, and I may be in my haste here and my lack of preparation, conflating a few different features of consciousness, up to a few that he identifies. But I'll do my best to keep them separate. This first one then is integrative. So what that means is, and this is very important for where we're going here, we see a bunch of different things as if they were one thing. We see a bunch of different things as if they were one thing. The rug is one thing, and it's a cacophony, except not in sound, in sight, whatever that word is, right? It's a unbelievable sensory input from a great many sources. And that seems somehow, the nature of consciousness seems to be to integrate those things and to see a number of things all at once. First point. That's a claim about consciousness. Consciousness is integrative, and maybe we could do a better job, but there's 3 words. First proposition. Second one, consciousness is perspectival. And here I mean something a little bit different. There are different perspectives which people consciously hold and have. Another way of putting this is that to be conscious is not only to see, and I don't just mean to sense, but in all of the extensions of our visible metaphor by analogy. We perceive, we understand, we consider. All of those sort of are ways of seeing, we say, but it's more than just sight that's involved, although sight is very often involved, but not necessarily involved, it turns out, right? As remarkable lives like Helen Keller point out, right? Not necessarily sight, but it's all seeing, it's all grasping, it's all understanding. And it's to see in that way that is what it is to be conscious, I'm claiming. At least I'm not claiming that yet. I'm saying here that it is an essential feature of consciousness. Okay, second proposition. Third is there is in consciousness what I'm going to call an enjoyment compute dynamism. There are 2 features of conscious life, and that is this is how things are, and it isn't exactly where I'd like it to be, or it's better than it used to be, and I'd like to make it be this way again. So there is preference as part of the conscious phenomena. Preference is somehow linked in there, and that's what I mean by the compute side of this. It's built on the enjoyment side. In other words, there are things that I see and experience that are things that I like and other things that I don't. And I compute, I plan, I think it through in order to bring about the states of affairs that I do, the states of affairs that somehow satisfy without making it a simple matter of idea satisfaction or of desire satisfaction. Dreams are not necessarily desires, right? Aspirations, admirations, right? All kinds of things like that. Beholding something beautiful, is that a desire, right? Maybe, I don't know. But it isn't it isn't a simple set of desires anyway. It's a very complex set. There's a whole range of things that we enjoy, and we do also compute at the very same time. This is because of this. It seems to be so, and I'd like to change this in order to bring that back or render it more probable. This enjoyment, compute, dynamism is fundamental to conscious experience so far as we know it. Now let's add another proposition here. And this phrase, this interface theory of perception, is grabbed from Donald Hoffman, but I don't mean to grab very much from Donald Hoffman in this proposition here. I definitely don't mean to grab conscious realism, which he clearly distinguishes from this interface theory of perception. His use of this interface theory of perception in his book, What is Reality? What's it called? The Case Against Reality. right? In that book, he makes a case that in fact our perception builds an interface, and that interface does not map homologously onto any reality that causally produces it. It doesn't map homologously, right? In other words, there's no one-to-one correspondence, right? That kind of mapping between the causes of this, call it reality, and the effects of this, call it perception. That, in spite of this correspondence theory of truth that has this intensely rich background, right? Aquinas, for example, was a very strong advocate of it, this correspondence theory of truth. Maybe not by that name, but he says there is a likeness that comes. He says Aquinas made these distinctions. In the case of God, this is very useful aside, right? In the case of God, the things are like God's knowledge because he makes them that way. God causes the things to be what they are, like an artisan, and thus the artisans are what fits in the mind of the artist, right? What is in the mind of the artist. And it doesn't come causally from the thing to the mind. It comes from the mind to the thing. In the case of God's knowledge, with us, Aquinas says there's that similar mapping, but the mapping, the causality, the mapping operates in the opposite direction. And the correspondence between my word, I forget, I'll have to think of, it's been a long time since reading Aquinas, so I won't even try, right? But that, what amounts to correspondence is a function of the effect on our minds of the reality out there. So the reality somehow imprints itself on us, and that there's a mapping, and when that mapping is correct, that's what it is to hold a true judgment. Okay, that is the correspondence theory. It's exactly what Hoffman is talking about, who's exactly in Aquinas, and that's just the single example I'll give of its rich history in ideas, lots of others. I chose that particular example for a reason that we'll come back to that example someday. So I grabbed that not just because it's old and famous, but because of the particular duality in it that between God's knowledge and our knowledge. We'll come back to it. In any case, this interface theory of perception says that correspondence you might hope there is provably not there. That's his claim. Now, it's a very strong theory of interface theory of perception. It basically says, look, you don't have any other choice, right? All your other thinking of what we perceive as other than an interface and instead a map, right? That just does not fly. It isn't true. And instead, as he says, he may even use the phrase a desktop theory. Well, the desktop is an interface, so I think he does use interface theory. So when you grab and move around a file, you're not grabbing and moving around the text in the file. And everybody knows that. You're grabbing a little blue visual indicator, right? And you're pulling it into a different place. But you're not pulling the words that are in the file or the numbers that are in the file, right? Or anything else that's in the file. You're not grabbing any of that and pulling that around. You're just changing an address, and it's got a cool little, which is our interface, and that's what perception is. What I'm saying is not, yeah.
Sorry if I could interrupt real quick. Yes. I do remember in the podcast, he used the description of the VR in the Ferrari, if you're playing a VR game. But then someone else in the podcast said that was a little misleading, and I couldn't remember exactly the criticism for that.
Sure. I of course, don't know that criticism, but let me mount this criticism, which Hoffman himself is quite well aware of, and other people are too. Well, look, when you do that, aren't you saying, you're saying, look, there really is a state of affairs out there, right? The state of affairs is you actually have a computer and you actually have information stored, right, in a particular physical system. which is the very thing that you seem to want to deny, but you're saying that's the real thing that's happening in your case of the Ferraris, when in fact you're playing take your favorite case, right? And the something auto, I'm trying to think of the name.
I think
Chase,
Grand
right?
Theft Auto.
Sure, exactly. Right. And you're contrasting that that interface, right, with something else and saying, look, it's just an interface. But you don't get to appeal, right, to you, Donald Hoffman, don't get to appeal to any real world out there to make a distinction between it and the interface, because you don't buy that real world out there. That's an objection. I don't know if it's the objection that you mentioned. But that's one. And Hoffman's answer is, you're right. All I'm pointing out here, I'm arguing on your terms, not on mine, he might say. Right? I'm basically saying that you recognize in your current model of the world that there are interfaces which are not the same as what's actually the case, right? And in your current model of the world, you think this is not the case because it doesn't correspond to this other thing, which actually is the case, right? I don't agree about which other thing actually is the case, but I do agree that there is something that is the case, and we just don't know what it is. We live in this perception in the same way someone would if they evolved to play Grand Theft Auto. That's all they did, right? And they have no idea what computers are. They would think, they would see, there'd be all kinds of correspondence. They could get shit done in the world. They could be world champion. They could be world class, right? And everybody else would unite with them about what they see. And yet it would not be the way the world really works. That is possible. And Hoffman uses that case as a crowbar to pry open your imagination for receiving that possibility that we might actually be living in an interface. All I'm trying to add here, I think, this will be a tough question. I don't think you need to buy his full argument. I don't think you need to buy conscious realism. He doesn't get to it from conscious realism, by the way. He gets to it from evolutionary theory, as enlivened by game theory and other mathematical tools, right? Interpreted maybe and shed light upon by those tools. That's what he uses. I don't think you even have to commit to that to entertain the interface theory of perception. You don't have to prove it's the only alternative. You could just lay it out there as a reasonable alternative, right? It is one way to look at. Here's the proposition, I think. One way to look at our perception is as an interface, as something that's in us and that may or may not correspond to anything out there in the world. Who knows how it gets here this way, but it is what it is, right? This is our perception. This is the way we see it. Maybe even space-time, if you're a physicist, is part of that perception. And for us, it's more like Newtonian conceptions of space and time, which is not quite the Einstein's conception of space-time, in terms of which, not just Einstein, lots of others, in terms of which physicists now think, or maybe think beyond, right, when they say space-time is dead. But before that, there's Newton, and Newton has these three spatial dimensions and some attraction between things, in terms of which we kind of understand gravity now in ordinary common sense. All of that world might be, we can view it as an interface. It is the way we experience things. how then one can ask, and here I don't want to jump ahead to problems that motivate these solutions. Let's just ask it this way. Why should we suppose there's anything other than what we experience? What if we tried that on for a moment? And here I think the proposition is that consciousness is fundamental, is not inconceivable. I think that's actually the proposition that you need. It's not inconceivable. It's not crazy to imagine the possibility that all there were experiences. Experiences of what? It's more like experience, it might be the question that's asked. And the answer is wrong question. Experiences for whom is the right question. And the answer is experiences for us. And we're putting you exactly in contact with your experiences. You cannot turn them down, nor can you point to anything outside them. You can point to explanations outside them. And yes, there are stories that about how those explanations arise. But all we're trying to do here is build the possibility to start with. You don't have to go as far as Hoffman, it seems to me, and destroy with evolutionary game theoretic arguments that there could be anything but an interface theory of perception, for example. I don't think you have to destroy it. I think you just have to let in the possibility that we might be perceiving through this interface, maybe even now the wrong word, although it may be the right word, but imagine it were just an interface to what? The next claim says, what if it were just an interface to other conscious agents? All there is that unthinkable? Is that all there is consciousness? That's a little stronger than conscious realism. Consciousness is certainly fundamental in that world because it's the beginning, middle, and an end. That's all there is, right? So it would certainly be thus consciousness first. You could have other versions of conscious realism. And maybe what I'm pointing to is, for now, let's leave those two things open, and would have to pause and put a caveat here. We're driving a wedge. Maybe conscious realism can be taken in two senses. Is it say that conscious is all that's real, or does it say that conscious is real in a fundamental way? If you could simply buy the second claim, and it's weaker. Okay. And one more claim. Let's see. The claim is this, I think. The difference is what makes an individual different than another individual is that they have different conscious experiences. You can see why I might call that conscious individuation. What individuates is consciousness. That's the very shortest claim about it. What does that mean? It means you're different than I am because what it is for you to be different than I am is for you to have different conscious experiences than I do. You'll have to admit it's hard to falsify that on its surface just by itself. Neither should you believe it necessarily. I mean, there's no argument for it just because it's not obviously false, right? But it's not so clear because it is true that different individuals, so far as we know, arguably have different conscious experiences. We talk about this all the time, right? You're looking at me and I'm looking at you, right? Those are different conscious experiences. Technically, that may be wrong. We're both looking at one another's little icons on the desktop. Fair enough. But I'm looking at all of that inside my computer frame, and you're looking at all that inside your computer frame, right? Those are different experiences. You are not the same as me. That's maybe that. That, I think it turns out, is an important, sorry about the little seizure I just threw with my desktop sharing here. Okay. So let me try one thing. Let me just try to put these things together. All I did so far is list them, and we haven't run through this together very carefully. And so we don't have much of a common experience of talking through what this lens looks like. Let me first try to make a whole of it, and then let me try to see what the world looks like through it. And all I want to do is initially motivate both of those things. Maybe there's a hole here, and maybe you see the world differently through this set, through this hole. So actually, let me reverse that, and I see why I want to do that. Okay, so let me reverse that order. Let me see if I can address some problems from this lens, and then come to realize that we were seeing through a single coherent lens while we were addressing those problems. And in fact, the coherence comes out in the range of problems that it addresses. Something like that. I don't know if I'm cheating there or not. This is so I'm trying this procedure out. Okay. First of all, there's this very difficult problem that the philosophical world has hit for a long time, and that is the hard problem of consciousness. How does consciousness arise? From this point of view, that's not a problem. That's the wrong problem. In fact, more nearly the right problem is, how does the order that we consciously experience, directly consciously experience in some measure, and indirectly consciously experience through the consciousness, through the conscious measurements that we take, and the conclusions from models of which we are conscious, that we run that, what we perceive as data, right, through those models, and we come to infer things or conclude things through those models, and predict, explain, and control our way through this conscious experience using those inferences, right? So this is a construction of science. Who was it that, I think it was a philosopher named Sellers, that coined the distinction between the manifest image and the scientific image. What he means there is something like the same thing I'm trying to point to. The manifest image is just the way the world appears to you, what it seems to be manifestly on its surface. And then there's the scientific image, which is different. It's got a very different account of the world. It says lots of things that you don't see, but it gets at those things because of other things that you do see. And I just described those as things which you measure, right? And models which you perceive, mathematical models which you perceive and employ. You have to understand them. You do perceive them. You plug data in, and you draw implications from it. You either explain, you predict, in engineering and control. All right, so the hard problem of consciousness turns around, and now it's got another problem. It doesn't have a hard problem of consciousness. It's got, how can you explain all the order, the regularity, the stuff that's in the world? And in a certain way, I just kind of did that. I just kind of said, well, actually, there's these tools that we're conscious of. There are elements of our conscious experience that we use to generate other conscious experience. And we do it through some pretty refined and precise application of various features of our conscious life. We're conscious of mathematical relations. We're conscious of measurements. We're conscious of possibilities. We're conscious of etc. And out of all of that, perhaps we build the world. Perhaps that's where our interface comes from. What it is that we perceive, whether we perceive it directly or we say we perceive it indirectly. Now I see that this has to be the case. Now I understand the world, but we're applying a model in a very theoretic way in that case. But we are, and it's so in a certain sense, it's part of our interface. It's part of what we perceive. It's part of our perceptual apparatus. It just doesn't come through what we call the senses, not directly. right? It involves, say, mathematical awareness, linguistic awareness. Drop all that in the senses and call it all senses. That's, you could say we're sensing all of that in some way. We're aware of all of that in some way. We didn't used to be aware of all of it, but we are now, right? To the extent that we are now. And you could say we now see. All right, I see, right? We've come to see, we've come to perceive, we've come to see. All perception. And in that sense, maybe all of that falls under this interface theory. What do I mean by that? I mean, this is a tool we use to get around in the world and to enjoy more of what we enjoy and to compute how to get more of it. The short version of it. Okay. So we've just looked back through the lens from the solution to the hard problem of consciousness and really comparing two problems. The hard problem of consciousness, about which we have precious little to say, and this possibility of perceiving the whole set of tools that we use to manipulate more of what we perceive, all inside our conscious mind. That doesn't seem so hard to start explaining how it could arise. How could modern science arise if there was no external reality? Well, the flippant answer is easy. Just describe that pathway. It looks easier to go down that road than it does down where the hell does consciousness come from, right? Where all this matter gets together in exactly the right way and boom, on turn the lights. Almost unthinkable. Remains a hard problem, an intractable problem. The other problem doesn't seem so intractable. All right, next. What the heck is personal identity? What the heck makes us who we are? Well, good question. What's the principle of individuation in the history of philosophy? That's a long question. For Aquinas, it was, I'm going to keep going back to him for reasons. For Aquinas, it was designated matter. It was particular prime matter, but not just any prime matter, as Aristotle said. It's this very particular prime matter, this stuff, designated matter. Somehow he thought you could sort of pick out a piece of it. And matter was the principle of individuation. And it's what makes it be the case that this cat is not the same as that cat, because they're both cats in this matter somehow, made up of this matter. That's a principle of individuation. So that's the meaning of it. In one particular case, an answer to the question, what is the principle of individuation? But here's another answer. It's just what you're consciously aware of. Precisely identical sets of consciousness are exactly the same. No distinction between them on this model. And what individuates is whatever it is that makes some conscious sets, some perspectives, somehow not the same as other perspectives. What would do that? Let's introduce one more phrase. Limited perspectival consciousness. Another feature of consciousness that we are stunningly aware of is that we are not aware of everything. We are aware of this, we could be aware of that, you were aware of that, I was not, thank you, now I am, right? That whole set of interchange trades on the limitedness of our perspective. We have perspectives, but they are not all encompassing. Isn't that wild? In some ways, that is in tension with integrative consciousness, because consciousness integrates. It is possible to be aware, to perceive two things at the same time, or at least it seems like it's at the same time for us. What do I mean by, certainly in conscious space, it's the same time, right? It's, yes, I see both. This is a relationship between these two things. One is on top of the other, right? They are different, and yet they are both united in the relationship in my instantaneous perception. Consciousness can bring the one out of many. It can bring unity out of many. That's ordinary. But it doesn't do that always and everywhere. That's pretty famous. There's stuff we don't see. I only see what's in front of me, not behind me. I only remember what I remember. I only dream about whatever's occurred to me. There are ideas I've never had, someone else has had them, etc. That whole exchange is also a feature of our conscious life because what is it? It's a feature of the way our consciousness changes, right? We seem to experience things in exchange with others. This is at least experiencing taking in our whole experience, set of consciousness as consciousness of others is part of our conscious experience. It's part of the model that we use. And so we seem to have limitations, and it's part of our model, our self-understanding. Okay, so then what it is to be you is different than what it is to be me. Your perspective is different, and particularly it's differently limited. It's alike in being limited, but it's not alike in being limited in the same way. You know what it's like to walk a mile in your shoes. I have to learn it slowly. Okay. Jump to neuroscience. So maybe we can say what personal identity is on this view. And now jump to neuroscience and say a leading account, Jeff Hawkins' account, an emerging theoretical account of what intelligence is this thousand brain theory. It's as if you look at the way our brain seems to be wired, and there are sort of neural correlates of consciousness here. It seems like different cortical columns are working problems at the same time. They're sparsely distributed, but they seem to be taking in a wide range, although a different wide range per column of input, and coming out with predictive output according to a model of the world, which each of them seems to have. And it's as if there's 1,000 different brains in here and they're all chewing away at something. Well, imagine that as a manifestation. I'd start with an analogy, but I mean more than an analogy eventually. I mean a manifestation of overcoming the limits, even more limited consciousness, even more limited perspective, being taken into account in the plural by an integrative consciousness, aware of all of the things that this might be as we experience it, and arriving at a conclusion, a preference, a chosen way forward perceptually. In other words, this is how I see it. And imagine that really emerges from a wide variety of different conscious agents, or rather, getting ahead of myself, of different perceiving, calculating. If they're calculating, are they also enjoying? Do they know what to aim at? Do they know whether this is good or bad? Let's suppose they do. Let's suppose all of that are emotional wiring, et cetera, everything else is, as put it this way, Hoffman thinks this is all illusory. I'm going to say it's not illusory, it's guiding, it's differently interpreted. What if all of that is the expression of the limitations? That is through the biological lens, the expression of the limitations of consciousness. In other words, this is, excuse me, John, one moment. Okay. Almost done here for tonight. Sorry, I've once again run myself in the wrong direction. Stop. Okay. So maybe it's the case then that there is here an account of personal identity which enables us to bring together into a less limited conscious set of experiences, which is now distinct from these others, but includes these others. You might imagine that goes forward, and you might imagine thinking that maybe there's a sense in which we would all say so in our language, a community knows what the individuals do not. The community knows how to work it out, but none of that knowledge sits inside a single brain because it's divided up, right? And there's patterns, there's culture, there's technology, there's all kinds of things. And the whole is an intelligently ordered system, but you only have individual members whose consciousness is limited and thus don't experience conscious identity with the whole of the community. It doesn't follow that whole of the community isn't conscious. In fact, there are many phrases we use that indicate that lead you to wonder whether it is conscious. And if it turns out all there is consciousness, then those suspicions that we have, or put it this way, those pointers that we can follow that lead us to ask whether a community is conscious, the answer becomes yes on this model. The community is conscious. There's nothing else. The community is collective consciousness. And every member of it is collective consciousness, but collecting less, operating under greater extent of limitations. Those limitations being lifted as we integrate our consciousness. In other words, this very nature of integrative consciousness and this very identification of consciousness as having certain perspectives which are limited in various ways, those limitations constituting the identity of the conscious agent, all of that can add in ways looking down into the more individuated, that in a way that makes a whole out of all of those smaller elements that we ourselves integrate, and in a way which makes a whole out of all of us smaller elements, which are in fact integrated in larger systems of which we are not ourselves aware. We're aware of them in a way. We're aware of them indirectly, but we are not aware as the community. We are aware of the community. But what I'm saying is, on this model, we are aware as a community of those elements of conscious reality that make up, that are expressed in their limitations through this desktop interface model of the 1,000 brains, or rather the 1,000 little brains that are wired together in the big brain that we all carry around with us. I could go on and say the strange world of quantum mechanics looks less strange from this perspective. And a lot of people say this, and they tend to be conscious realists. And they pay attention to quantum mechanics, and they say, look at these strange features. They're mysterious, they're inexplicable. They don't make any sense at all. They seem inconsistent with realism, etc. Well, that's what they seem unless they are the artifacts of the models that we have that express the limitations we have as we drive from the limited things we enjoy toward a broader sense of things that we enjoy, toward a greater unity with other conscious agents as we connect ourselves up. All of those are models. They are mathematical tools that we generate to interact with our consciousness in various sorts of ways to extend it beyond its limitations. And that's what's going on in conscious life. That's this perspectival conscious realism lens. So you don't have to believe a word of that. Or for that matter, I think it's plainly the case you don't have to understand a word of it to understand what a high information flow network of rich communities is, and to see that there's some promise out of that set of propositions, out of that lens. But here's another lens, and it really transforms a lot of things. And you could imagine putting it together and building a community of folks who adhere to, who take on that conscious realist lens and proceed perhaps through all of the disciplines of science as if that conscious realist lens were worth trying out together. And that would be the sorts of problems they could solve that weren't on the conscious realism list and that aren't on the high information flow network of rich communities list. There may yet be some problems which emerge as soluble when you put the two together. That's certainly the case, but I'm going to wait to give an example for another night. It's going to be absolutely the case when we drop in this third lens, which is even a little harder to define, but in some ways less complex. It's just that I've spent less time, not with some elements of it, but putting together the whole lens as a whole. And in some ways, because it's more familiar to me, the stuff I just did in the middle is less familiar to me. I had become familiar with it, right? How on earth do you see the world? How can you possibly, after all, this high information flow network of rich communities, you take a limit of it and it points to the integration of all of knowledge. What on earth is that? What are the rules for doing it? Why think it's advantageous to do it? Why think it's possible for doing it? All of that has to be worked out. And that's what I'm trying to work out here in identifying this concept of these lenses and these propositional members, right? Together in very small lenses and then several of them together in larger lenses, with the possibility of there being multiple larger lenses and the possibility of bringing all these things together and doing that in limited sort of ways, and as if we were constructing. There's sort of a conceptual construction craft here for how you're going to build a big building that is this big building that we need to build as an example to plug into this high information flow network rich community infrastructure in this new town, which is this healthy, robust, pluralistic set of rich communities that grow and grow and grow to a very substantial size and rebuild intellectual life so that they can exist, grow, achieve maturity, and interplay with one another, all processing the conceptual space that's available to humankind, something like that. Thanks for taking all that in, John. I wanted to try to pound it out, and I haven't had a chance to do that yet. So this was the night.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually just today listened to Lex Friedman when he was on Joe Rogan's podcast. He just recently went on there.
Nice.
Would you say he thinks about the world in a similar way? Because I thought he was kind of bringing up quite a few similar points to what you've been talking about today.
Well, I'll tell you this. I listen to all the people that he talks to. Not all of them, but I probably listened to half his podcasts, and more than half. I haven't quantified them for a while, but I haven't missed one since somewhere in the 70s, and I got a lot of the ones before that, hit or miss. So the answer is it wouldn't surprise me, but he does more listening in his AI podcast than he does speaking, although he speaks a lot. But he's more or less speaks about what people bring to the table. So
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to listening to that podcast. I knew he went again on Rogan, and I've seen it there, but I haven't. I'm looking forward to listening to him. I've instead
Did you
been
say
listening. Go ahead.
Maybe he's pretty young, isn't he?
Who's this now?
Lex Friedman?
Oh, yeah, he's very young.
Right.
He is roughly, put it this way, his father is my age. He might be within a year. He interviewed his father, and I listened to that interview.
Okay.
Yeah,
I thought you just said something about what had you been listening to since the 70s?
Oh, yeah, since the 70s, not the 1970s, since his podcast in the numbers 70s. He's up to 120 something now, or I forget what his number is, right?
Okay.
So I'm saying I probably caught nearly all. Put it this way, if I missed it, for whatever reason, I decided I was going to let one go. But that's the rule is I listen to every one of them for a long time. So I'm saying I wouldn't be surprised that I think he's chewing on an integrated account of the world without necessarily telling him that. That's his bent. He may not have the same, I don't think he has these tools and thus aspires to as much integration as I think is possible. But I think he's certainly trying that. Just intellectually, he is trying that.
Yeah.
So I'll listen.
He was talking about like letting go of the ego and id and comparing humanity to similarly to how we look at an ant colony as just one thing. Like humans are basically the same way. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, I'll take that in as soon as I can.
Yeah, it's not. I think it's probably very different. Have you watched much Joe Rogan?
No, he's not somebody I listen to all the time.
I don't listen to him a ton either. It's very different than Friedman's podcast. I think they talked about kind of a wild range of random stuff, but it was interesting.
Right. Yeah, I've heard a few people. I've heard Elon Musk, for example, comes to mind on Rogan's podcast, and I think I caught. Is this Friedman's second time there? So have I maybe heard him there the first time?
I think they mentioned it on the podcast, and they were saying it might have been his fourth or fifth time. So
okay, good. Well, I think maybe I caught an earlier one.
Yeah.
All right. So, John, thanks for joining me this evening. I'm going to let you reclaim the rest of your Friday here, and I'll do the same. I've been, social life calls.
Yep, definitely. All righty. Have a good night.
Thanks. Bye-bye.